Have you ever imagined finding out that your own family is planning to put you in a nursing home? Not because you asked for help, not because you need special care, but simply because they've decided you've become a burden? That's exactly how I discovered the fate they had prepared for me. Not from my son's mouth, not with a look of courage, or even a gesture of consideration. I discovered it through the cold screen of my phone, when a message from my granddaughter appeared before my eyes. "Grandma, Dad said you're going to the nursing home next week. Don't be sad, it's for your own good." As if any solace could be found in that cruel sentence. As if the word good fit in the same sentence in which I was discarded like an old piece of furniture, out of place. At that moment, my heart shattered. I, who had dedicated my entire life to caring for my family, who had given up my dreams and worked myself to exhaustion so that my son could have opportunities one never had, was now being paid with a sentence of invisibility. It wasn't just abandonment. It was humiliation. It was the certainty that, to them, I was nothing more than an annoying old woman, ready to be cast aside. And what hurt most wasn't the decision itself, but the cold, cowardly, almost bureaucratic way I was informed. By text. Without a look. Without a hug. Without the courage to face my pain. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt as if your entire history had been erased in a second, as if years of sacrifice and love had lost their value in the face of haste and indifference? Because that's how I felt. With every word of that message, it felt like my identity was being ripped away. I was no longer the mother who carried heavy bags, the woman who sewed clothes until dawn, the grandmother who cradled her granddaughter in her arms. I was just a problem to be solved. That morning, the tears fell uncontrollably. There was no one in the room, just me, my phone, and the crushing weight of a truth too hard to swallow. The silence of the house, which had once welcomed me, now suffocated me. And the message, repeated on the screen, shone like a scar I would never forget. But along with the pain, something began to blossom within me. It was a mixture of indignation and resilience. I knew this story couldn't end there. It wasn't fair that life, which had knocked me down so many times, would deal me this blow without even giving me the right to fight. And as tired, fragile, and invisible to their eyes as I was, there was still a flame burning within me. The planned abandonment, the cruelty hidden behind the excuse of taking care of me. It all hurt me in a way I can't explain. But at the same time, it gave me strength I thought was gone. Because there are times when the pain is so deep that we have no choice but to get up. And I knew, somehow, that they hadn't seen the last of me yet. And so it was, with shaking hands and teary eyes, that I made a silent decision. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be quick, but they would learn the hard way that no one can erase the story of a woman who fought her entire life. What happened after that message? Well, that's what you're about to hear. My name is Evelyn, I'm 72 years old, and before this tragedy that changed the course of my life, I had a simple but meaningful routine. I always enjoyed waking up early, smelling the freshly brewed coffee, opening the window, and watching the sun rise. These were small gestures that reminded me that, despite all the hardships, I still had the strength to carry on. I've been a seamstress my entire life. I started when I was young because I needed a living after my son's father left us. It was just me and an old sewing machine, which made more noise than it was useful, but which was my companion through so many sleepless nights. I worked tirelessly. While the neighbors rested, I sat with tired eyes and calloused hands, finishing another order to deliver. All to ensure my son had a better life than mine. He didn't ask for anything, but I insisted. I wanted him to have nice clothes, new books, hot food on the table, and, above all, opportunities one never had. With each stitch, it was as if I were also embroidering the dreams I had for him. Have you ever sacrificed so much for someone that you forgot yourself? Because that's exactly what I did. I gave my youth, my health, my energy without a second thought. While other women were out, dating or traveling, I was at home, bent over fabrics, transforming scraps of cloth into party dresses for other mothers' daughters. And ironically, each time I delivered a dress, I imagined what it would be like to see my son fulfilled, educated, building a solid future. That was what drove me. People always told me I was strong. And, indeed, I believed it. After all, it's not easy raising a child alone, dealing with the rejection of a husband who turned his back, enduring society's judgmental gaze, and still holding my head high. I kept going because I believed that every sacrifice would be worth it in the end. This was my hidden truth. The idea that every sacrifice would have a positive impact on my son's future. But life has a curious way of testing us. Often, what we do for love turns into silence, and that silence weighs more heavily than any difficult journey. I believed he saw everything, that he recognized every effort, every sleepless night. But looking back now, I realize that perhaps I overestimated that gratitude. Perhaps I believed too much that the memory of sacrifice remains alive in those who receive it. I sewed for weddings, baptisms, and 15th birthdays. I saw families smile at the clothes I made myself, but often no one knew the price I paid. Because sewing wasn't just a job, it was a piece of my life given away. I was part of so many people's happiness behind the scenes, but my own joy was always put off. This shaped me, instilled in me a mindset of resilience. But this mindset, which seemed to protect me, also imprisoned me. I learned to endure in silence, to swallow tears, to convince myself that everything was for a greater good. And when my son grew up, I truly thought I'd made it. He graduated, got a good job, and built his own house. I remember the day he received his diploma. My heart overflowed. I cried like I'd never cried before, but they were tears of pride. I told myself, it was worth it. It was all worth it. But time has shown me that our decisions don't always bring the results we expect. The truth is, as I carried the weight of my choices, it felt too light, as if I'd forgotten my roots. The impact of this discovery wasn't immediate, but accumulated in small ways. Visits became more frequent, conversations shorter, and gestures of affection more rare. Little by little, I realized that the woman I once was, the one who sacrificed herself, who gave everything, who built an entire life alone to support a child, was no longer remembered with the same intensity. And here lies one of the harshest revelations of my life. Love doesn't guarantee gratitude. Sacrifice doesn't guarantee recognition. I learned this the hard way, when I realized that what I believed to be a legacy could actually be seen as nothing more than an obligation. And this realization was like a punch in the gut, because I never prepared myself for this possibility. I always thought my journey of struggle would turn into respect. But real life has other plans. And I, at 72, had to face the bitter side of this truth. Even so, something inside me told me this story wasn't over. Because even before the message that shattered me, even before the humiliation that forced me to see the coldness of my own family, I already sensed something strange in the air. Signs that, at the time, I chose to ignore, but which have now become impossible to forget. In the months leading up to that message, I'd already sensed something wasn't right. It wasn't sudden, but a slow, almost imperceptible process that began to erode the routine of the house and my inner peace. You know when the silence of a room seems to speak louder than any words? It was exactly like that. I'd walk into the kitchen, and immediately, the whispering would cease. Daniel and Emily would exchange quick, almost knowing glances and change the subject as if nothing had happened. I instinctively knew there was a hidden truth lingering in the air, but my heart refused to accept it. The visits also changed in tone. Before, Emily would sit next to me, tell me about school, show me photos on her phone, ask questions about my youth, as if genuinely curious about my story. Suddenly, everything became rushed. She would come in, give me a quick kiss, and retreat to her room, without time to listen to my stories or even look me in the eye. This silent, almost cruel distancing had a devastating impact on me. It was as if my presence had lost its value, as if I had ceased to be part of the family and had become just a forgotten detail behind the scenes. Have you ever felt the weight of being ignored in your own home? It's like disappearing in slow motion. At first, you try to justify it. They're busy, it's just a phase. Everything will go back to normal soon. I repeated this to myself like a prayer. But inside, a strange feeling crept in, a kind of warning I didn't want to hear. I continued preparing meals, taking care of the house, fulfilling my invisible role, because I believed that routine had the power to fix what was broken. But with each passing day, the distance grew. The calls that once filled me with joy became rare. Daniel, who always said, "Mom, I'll call you tonight," began to forget. When I reminded him, he responded impatiently, as if I were demanding too much. It was painful because his mindset seemed to have changed, and I couldn't understand why. I remember one night in particular. We were having dinner, just the three of us. The conversation, which always revolved around Emily, school, and future plans, suddenly became uncomfortable. Daniel looked at me strangely, as if he were weighing his words before speaking. Emily, meanwhile, kept her head down, picking at her plate without touching her food. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. And it was in that moment that I realized there were decisions being made behind the scenes in my own life, decisions I wasn't involved in, but that would change everything. Our minds try to find explanations to ease the pain. I told myself that maybe I was exaggerating, that I was interpreting non-existent signals. But deep down I knew it wasn't an exaggeration. It was a silent revelation unfolding day after day, a script written without my participation. I was merely a spectator in a cruel transformation, where love gave way to distance and care turned into calculated coldness. This journey of noticing the first signs was perhaps more painful than the message itself that would come later, because while the message brought confirmation, these signs left me living in a kind of emotional purgatory. It was as if every gesture contained a hidden truth, a warning that something terrible was about to happen. I tried to convince myself that nothing would change, but every averted glance, every unspoken word, pushed me closer to a reality I didn't want to see. And deep down I knew. A mother's heart feels. Our bodies react before our minds admit it. It was a tightness in my chest, a constant restlessness, a feeling that I was about to lose not only my home, but also the place I'd built within my own family. And this feeling grew until it became impossible to ignore. It was at this point that I began to pay attention to every detail, every seemingly innocent gesture. Because when love begins to grow cold, silence becomes the loudest scream. And it was precisely in this silence that I found the first clues that my life was about to be turned upside down. A week before that message that changed everything, Daniel came home with flowers in his hands. I remember the scene exactly. The scent of red roses filled the room, and for a moment, my heart warmed. He handed me the bouquet and said with a restrained smile, "Mom, you are special." They were simple words, but they carried an impact I hadn't expected. After so many averted glances, so many interrupted conversations, and so many signs of distance, that gesture took me by surprise. It was as if, suddenly, my suspicions had been a figment of my imagination. I convinced myself that perhaps I was exaggerating, that my tired mind was making up stories that didn't exist. That night, I sat with him at the table and noticed Daniel was more attentive. He asked if I needed anything, mentioned that he remembered the nights I spent sewing to make ends meet, and even laughed at old memories, like when he'd hide under the table as a little boy to scare me. I felt immense relief. It was as if a hidden truth had been revealed. Maybe I'd misjudged. Maybe it was all just a bad phase. The human mind has this need to cling to any sign of hope when pain becomes unbearable. I allowed myself to believe. I spent the next few days feeling lighter, almost with a sense of transformation. I thought the coldness of the last few weeks had simply been the result of fatigue, work, and the fast pace of modern life. The mindset that haunted me was clear. Nothing is lost. He still remembers who I am and what I've done for him. This thought comforted me, like a blanket on a cold night. But what I didn't know was that that gesture was part of something bigger, a kind of silent preparation for the storm to come. Behind the scenes, decisions had already been made. I had no idea my life was about to change so cruelly, but looking back, I can see how calculated the timing of that attention was. It was like offering a sip of water to someone thirsty, only to then snatch the glass from their hands. In the days that followed, Emily also showed more presence. She sat down with me one afternoon and asked about my past, about what it was like raising Daniel alone, about how I found the strength to carry on when it seemed impossible. Her eyes shone with curiosity, and I felt valued again. I felt like my stories mattered, that my legacy hadn't been forgotten. This conversation re-energized me. For a few minutes, I believed the impact of my sacrifices was finally being recognized. But inside me, there was still a low, almost whispered voice that wouldn't leave me alone. I ignored it, of course, because believing in hope was much easier than facing the revelations that were approaching. I preferred to live those moments as if they were genuine. I allowed myself to smile, cook my favorite dish for them, feel the pleasure of being with family again. Have you ever been there? Have you ever believed a loving gesture only to discover later there was a hidden intention behind it? That was exactly the trap I fell into. I didn't know it, but I was experiencing what I now call the silence before the storm. Because while I was lulled into the illusion that everything was working out, reality was already in motion, advancing like an invisible wave about to break. It's painful to think how our hearts can deceive themselves. But at the same time, it's human. We all need to believe, even for a moment, that redemption exists. This brief hope was what gave me the strength to face what would come next, even if I wasn't aware of it at the time. And it was precisely in this contrast, between the unexpected affection and the cold decision already in the making, that my journey took an irreversible turn. I only realized the full extent of this mistake when the pieces began to fall into place in a way too cruel to ignore. That morning, I woke to soft light streaming through the window. The day seemed to begin like any other, but there was a strange restlessness within me, a feeling I couldn't explain. I picked up my phone to check the time, never imagining that in a few seconds my world would be shattered. The screen lit up the room, and among the usual notifications was a message from Emily. I opened it casually, perhaps expecting a "Good morning, Grandma," but what I found was like a blade cutting deep. "Grandma, Dad said you're going to the nursing home next week. Don't be sad, it's better this way." My eyes scanned those words slowly, as if my mind were trying to reject what it read. It was surreal. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. I felt such a tightness in my chest that I thought my heart would give out. The letters on the screen seemed to dance before me, but the message was there, clear, without room for doubt. That was it. They had decided for me. They had planned my destiny like someone organizing a move, and I was only finding out because my innocent granddaughter thought she was comforting me. Have you ever experienced a moment when the ground simply disappears beneath your feet? Because that's exactly how I felt. My hands trembled, tears flowed uncontrollably, and a sense of humiliation washed over me. They didn't even have the courage to tell me to my face. They didn't look me in the eye. They didn't even give me a chance to argue. They discarded me as if I were an ancient object, too heavy to carry. At that moment, an avalanche of memories washed over me. I found myself sewing until dawn to pay for Daniel's school fees. I recalled cold nights when he slept warm because I preferred to give up the blanket. I relived every choice, every decision in which I had put my son above myself. And now, all that remained was a cold, impersonal text message, dictating my future as if it were an order. The impact was devastating, not only because I felt betrayed, but because I realized that all the sacrifice seemed to have been in vain. It's strange how pain can manifest itself in silence. I didn't scream, I didn't break anything, I didn't ask for an explanation. I stood there, cell phone in hand, staring at that sentence over and over, as if searching for a hidden escape between the words. But there was no escape. The hidden truth was there, stark and raw. I was no longer seen as a mother, as a grandmother, as someone with value. I was seen as a burden. The vulnerability of that moment was unbearable. The house felt bigger, colder, as if every wall had receded. The silence of the room mingled with the silence within me. I wondered, how could someone who dedicated their entire life to a family end up like this, reduced to a decision made behind the scenes, without a voice, without the right to choose? And at the same time, something inside me began to awaken. It was as if, behind the pain, there was a spark of resilience. I was broken, yes, but not defeated. The humiliation was so profound that it awakened a hidden strength within me, an unexpected transformation. Because if they believed they could discard me without consequences, They didn't know the woman I truly am. This message was more than a warning. It was a brutal revelation, a mirror showing me the reality I was reluctant to accept. It wasn't just about aging, about necessary care, about the natural fragility of life. It was about planned abandonment, decisions made without compassion, a calculated coldness that completely ignored my history. I cried like I hadn't cried in years. They weren't just tears of sadness, but of indignation, of pent-up anger. And as the tears wet my hands, I felt something inside me shift. It was as if the pain was pushing me on a new journey, one I never imagined I'd take. That day, I sat on the edge of my bed and remained motionless for hours, reliving every word, every recent gesture that now made sense. The whispers in the kitchen, the averted glances, the sudden, almost rehearsed attention. It all clicked. The storm I'd feared had finally arrived, and now there was no turning back. What remained before me was a painful crossroads: passively accept the fate they had decided for me, or find a way to show that my voice still existed, that my life still had value. And it was in this silent conflict that I began to realize that, even wounded, I still had the strength within me to fight back. What came after this message was the beginning of a transformation no one could have imagined. I spent days locked in my room, crying silently, trying to understand when my life had turned upside down. My phone was still on the nightstand, the message right there, like an open wound I couldn't bring myself to erase. It was impossible to pretend nothing had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, the words came back to me, cold and cruel, reminding me that, to them, I was no longer part of the family, just a problem to be solved. The isolation began almost imperceptibly, but it grew stronger day by day. First came the silences at mealtimes. Daniel and Emily would sit at the table, laughing at jokes that didn't include me, exchanging glances I couldn't decipher. When I approached, the laughter would cease, and the mood would suddenly change, as if my presence were a weight they impatiently carried. Soon after, they began serving me food separately, as if I no longer had a place among them. They would leave my plate on the tray and knock lightly on the door, without exchanging a word, without looking me in the eye. This decision, hidden behind routine, was like a blow. They no longer saw me as someone who belonged in that home. Have you ever felt like you've become invisible in your own home? It's not just loneliness. It's the feeling of being alive, but erased. It's walking through the same hallways that were once filled with voices and now echo with emptiness. That space, which should have been my safe haven, became hostile territory. Every corner reminded me that I was a stranger in my own home. Their mindset was clear: to prepare me, little by little, for my definitive departure. It was as if they were rehearsing my absence before they even took me there. I, who had once been at the center of decision-making, was now relegated to a secondary role, with no right to speak. Conversations took place behind closed doors, whispers hushed. And when I tried to ask questions, I received evasive, cold answers, as if my questions didn't deserve attention. The hours inside the room seemed to drag on. The silence was only interrupted by the sound of the television in the living room, by the muffled laughter I heard from afar. Each laugh was a painful revelation. They still knew how to smile, but without me. I wondered if they realized the impact they were having, or if they had already severed any emotional ties with me. Because their coldness wasn't carelessness, it was a decision. A calculated decision to diminish me, to get me used to the idea that I was no longer part of their lives. And all the while, I was drowning in memories. I relived my entire journey. The first uniform I bought for Daniel with the money I'd spent sewing all night, the birthdays I'd made sure to bake simple yet loving cakes, the advice I'd given him when he felt lost. These memories, which had once given me strength, were now laden with a hidden truth. Everything I'd done seemed to have left no roots. It was as if my choices, my sacrifices, had evaporated into time. Yet, amid the tears and the silence, something in me began to change. I couldn't simply accept this humiliation. There was a scream trapped inside me, begging to be released. It wasn't just anger, it was dignity. It was the awareness that I had a story, and that no one, not even those I loved most, had the right to erase it. This awakening was slow, but real. A silent transformation was beginning to emerge amidst the injustice. The impact of each meal left on my doorstep, each door closed behind me, created a space within me I hadn't known existed. A space of resistance. I observed everything in silence, but behind that silence, decisions were being formed. Decisions that would change the course of history. They thought isolation would break me, that invisibility would make me give up fighting. But what they didn't know is that sometimes, it's in isolation that we find clarity. And it was during this time locked away, feeling discarded, that I began to clearly see every detail of what was really happening. And deep down, I knew, what seemed like mere abandonment hid something even greater, something I was about to discover. And as I lived through that forced isolation, lost in memories and the pain of feeling invisible, I realized that it wasn't just my story that was at stake. How many other mothers, how many other grandmothers, carry within themselves the same silent wound? How many go through this same journey of abandonment disguised as care? That's why I feel that sharing what I experienced is not just a vent, but also an invitation for you, the listener, to share your voice. If anything in this story has upset you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, a single sentence of yours can be the strength someone else needs to not feel alone. And if this story touched your heart in any way, please like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but every like helps this message reach further, reaching others who may be experiencing the same pain. This is how we create a space where stories like mine aren't hidden behind the scenes, but gain light and impact. And of course, if you want to continue following real stories, filled with emotion, revelations, and lessons that are often left unsaid, subscribe to the channel. Your participation here is what makes this community grow, what gives meaning so that these memories and experiences are not forgotten. Together, we transform pain into reflection, silence into voice, invisibility into presence. Because, deep down, when I share all of this, I'm not just talking about myself. I'm opening a door for all of us to look inward, rethink our decisions, mindsets, and values. And as this silent transformation took place within me, even amidst tears and closed doors, one specific detail began to change the way I saw everything that was happening. It was in this heavy silence, amidst so many suppressed tears, that something inside me awakened. Until then, I had merely reacted to what they were doing, absorbing each blow, accepting the humiliation as if it were inevitable. But in that moment, a simple, almost instinctive thought changed the direction of my journey. I realized I held in my hands a weapon they could never have imagined: my cell phone. It wasn't just an ordinary object, it was a tool that could transform vulnerability into strength, silence into voice. The decision came as a breath of courage. While Daniel and Emily talked in the kitchen, I left the device recording near the door. Every word spoken, every cold sentence, every plan about how much better it would be for everyone if I went to the home, was recorded. They had no idea that, behind the closed door, the hidden truth was being revealed. I was no longer just a spectator to the injustice, but a witness gathering evidence of what they were trying to cover up. The feeling was one of immediate transformation. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just surviving abandonment, I was taking action. It was as if a flame that had seemed extinguished within me had flared up again. My mindset shifted. I no longer thought only of the pain, but of the impact those recordings could have. If I ever needed to prove what they were doing, I would have not just memories or fragile words, but concrete, undeniable records. And with each new recording, I grew stronger. The isolation that once consumed me now became a silent strategy. They believed they were reducing me to silence, but it was precisely in silence that I found power. I began to listen more closely, to observe the details, to record not just phrases but also the tone of voices, the contempt hidden in every comment. What had once crushed me now became fuel for resistance. Have you ever felt the strength that comes from realizing you're not completely powerless? That's exactly what I experienced. With each click of the record button, I felt like I was regaining a piece of the dignity they tried to take from me. I knew that what I was building there wasn't just an audio archive, but a form of justice. And the curious thing is that, while they acted so nonchalantly, unaware they were being watched, I began to notice nuances that had previously escaped me. It was like watching backstage at a cruel theater, where I had long been the deceived character. Now, I was backstage too, but with a different perspective. I saw the revelations hidden between the lines, the calculation behind every seemingly kind gesture, the coldness of decisions disguised as care. This process transformed me profoundly. The pain was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. On the contrary, it was what drove me to keep recording everything, to not give up, to wait for the right moment. With each recording, I wondered what the impact would be when the truth came out. Because I knew that, sooner or later, all of this could no longer be hidden. Forced isolation turned into strategic observation. Sadness became fuel for resistance. The feeling of being invisible gave way to the certainty that I held something powerful in my hands. They believed they were in control, but the reality was different. The tide had begun to turn, even if they didn't know it. And it was at this point in my journey that I realized that vulnerability can become strength when we find a way to act. It wasn't just a matter of revenge, but of justice, of showing that a lifetime of sacrifice couldn't be erased by a cruel decision made behind the scenes. I knew what I was holding back would be decisive. From that moment on, their every gesture, every word, took on a new meaning. They weren't just insults or signs of abandonment. They were pieces of a puzzle that would one day reveal the whole truth. And deep down, I knew there was still much to be revealed. Because what seemed like mere evidence gathering was, in fact, the beginning of a turning point that would change everything. The day they finally tried to take me, something inside me was already prepared. It wasn't a surprise, because all the signs were already clear. Every cold gesture, every hushed conversation behind closed doors, every glance that avoided mine. The difference was that this time, I wasn't defenseless. They believed they had complete control, that their decisions would be carried out without resistance, but I had already learned that pain can be a powerful push toward transformation. When Daniel appeared before me, with that firm voice, trying to disguise as concern what was merely indifference, I felt a strange calm. I already held in my hands something that would completely change the course of that story. As he spoke, I remembered the weight of the audio recordings. Every indifferent sentence, every calculated plan to dispose of me, was recorded with clarity and precision. They weren't just vague memories or emotional accusations. They were proof, concrete revelations that revealed the hidden truth of what had been happening behind the scenes. They thought they were writing a story of silent abandonment, but they didn't know I was the narrator who would expose the impact of each of their decisions. When the police arrived, called by neighbors who were suspicious of the commotion and noticed the tension, I felt like life was giving me a breath of justice. I handed my cell phone to the officer. There was not just the story of an elderly woman being isolated, but a stark portrait of planned, intentional abandonment, without any human consideration. It was at that moment that I realized there is something greater than our personal strength, a kind of invisible law, as many call divine justice or the law of return. Because, deep down, everything we do comes back to us in some way. Have you ever had that feeling of seeing life give you the answer at the exact moment when there seemed no way out? That's what happened to me. I, who had felt so small, invisible, discarded, was now listened to attentively. Each recording left no room for justification. It was the naked truth, unmasked, echoing in an environment where they no longer had any place to hide. The coldness with which they discussed how it would be better to send me away was so clear that even the police officers exchanged looks of indignation. The impact of that moment was immense. Not only because someone finally believed in me, but because I realized that my journey of pain had become an opportunity to show that life demands its toll, sooner or later. What Daniel and Emily thought would be a simple process of removing me from the scene ended up turning against them like a mirror. The same words they used to hurt me now became evidence against them. It was the law of retribution playing out before my eyes. And as painful as it was, there was a part of me that felt relief. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. It was the certainty that my silence hadn't been in vain, that my silent vulnerability had become a voice. I saw in their expressions the shock of someone who never imagined they'd be confronted for what they'd said in secret. They hadn't expected the woman they deemed fragile to have found the strength to rise up. This revelation hit them like a blow, perhaps even harder than the one they tried to deliver to me. That day, I understood something essential. When they try to reduce us, it is precisely at that point that we can find unexpected power. My decision to record wasn't born of anger, but of the need to preserve my dignity. And that choice was what changed everything. Because justice came not only from the police, but from life itself, which took it upon itself to show that no one escapes the consequences of their actions. I didn't know what the next steps would be, but within me there was a new certainty. The journey that began with tears and isolation now took an unexpected turn. Fate had shown its face and made it clear that you can't erase someone's story without paying a price. And as I took a deep breath in that turning point, I realized there was still so much more to be faced. Because justice may come, but rebuilding after so much pain is a process that requires courage. And I was only at the beginning of that journey. After that day when everything came to light, my life was never the same. And, in a way, I'm glad you didn't come back. Because although I felt the deepest pain, I also discovered a strength I never imagined I had. It was as if life had pulled me from the darkness to show me that there were still paths to rebuilding, even after so much abandonment. Today, I live with Margaret, a longtime friend who welcomed me like a sister. Her home became mine too, and in that simple space, I rediscovered something that seemed lost, a sense of belonging. Margaret is the kind of person who sees beyond appearances. With her, I didn't need to hide my wounds or silence my pain. And it was in this welcoming environment that I began to rediscover myself. I discovered that I still had the right to laugh, still had the privilege of planting, caring, and creating. I bought some flower seedlings, placed them in small pots in the backyard, and each morning as I watered those plants, I felt as if I were also watering a new phase of my journey. Small gestures, like the crochet I do on quiet afternoons, became a way for me to reconnect with myself. And in those moments, I realized that dignity isn't lost when someone devalues us. Dignity is something that is reborn when we choose to rise up. Have you ever gone through a phase where you thought all was lost, and suddenly found strength in the simplest details? This transformation doesn't happen overnight, but begins when we accept that our story doesn't end in abandonment. When I look back, I see that every tear was also a push to get me here. Because life, in some mysterious way, has its own way of dispensing justice. Many call it the law of return, and I believe in it. Those who act carelessly may even think they've won, but sooner or later, the weight of their own choices comes knocking. And meanwhile, we who have been wounded can also choose what to do with these scars. I chose to transform them into learning experiences. My mindset has shifted. I no longer see myself solely as the woman who was isolated, deceived, and discarded. I see myself as a survivor of a cruel truth, but also as someone who has found new paths. With each crochet stitch, with each flower that blooms in the yard, I feel like I'm rebuilding not only the present, but also the image of who I truly am. A woman who dedicated her life to her family but now allows herself to exist on her own. This new phase brought me powerful revelations. I realized that we spend so much time living for others that we forget that we also deserve to live for ourselves. I spent decades being the foundation of a house that, in the end, tried to expel me. Today, I understand that it was not in vain, because everything I did reflected who I am. Someone capable of loving deeply, but also of rising again after a fall. And that is what defines true strength. The impact of living with Margaret is that friendship can also be a home. She doesn't replace the family that turned their backs on me, but she reminds me every day that true bonds don't have to be blood. And perhaps this is one of the greatest lessons of my journey. Family is also those who choose to stay. This decision to open my heart again was what saved me. But don't think it was easy. The pain still resurfaces in memories, in flashbacks of moments you'd rather forget. Sometimes, looking at my hands, scarred by years of work, I wonder if everything could have been different. However, I learned not to let those memories imprison me. I learned to use them as proof that I survived, that I'm still here, breathing, resisting. And in this process of rebuilding, I realized that it's never too late to start over. Life has shown me that, even when everything seems lost, there's always a new beginning. It may be silent, simple, almost invisible to outsiders. But within us, it's like a rebirth. Today, every morning I wake up in the room Margaret so lovingly prepared for me. I feel like I've been given a second chance. And perhaps that's what keeps my faith so alive. The certainty that nothing happens by chance. That even abandonment can become a bridge to something greater. Because life always demands, but it also offers opportunities for healing. And deep down, I know that this story, which seemed to end in tears, still holds chapters no one could have predicted. Little by little, I began to understand that life doesn't just hand us wounds, it also hands us choices. And I chose not to let pain be the last word in my story. I could have let myself wither in silence, resigning myself to the idea that I was just a burden, as they tried to make me believe. But I discovered that there is a strength that arises when we decide not to accept others' lies as our truth. It is this transformation that has brought me here, sitting now, recounting every detail of my journey, because I believe stories have an impact when they are shared, and because I know there are many other voices that still remain silent. I want to say something to all the ungrateful children who think a mother's memory ages along with her wrinkles. It doesn't. What was given with love remains alive, even when you pretend to forget. And I want to leave a clear message. Those who sow abandonment reap loneliness. It may take time, it may come in different forms, but life always finds a way to return what we offer to others. This is the hidden truth that many refuse to see, but which will one day be revealed. And to you who are listening now, I want you to take this lesson to heart. Never accept being treated as a burden. Never allow the mindset of those who don't know how to value you to turn you into something disposable. Our story has value, our scars tell a journey, and our lives, even in the quietest phases, carry dignity. The impact of what we experience cannot be measured by the cold gaze of those who forget, but by the courage to carry on, even when everything pushes us to the ground. I learned that loneliness isn't the end when we find within ourselves the power to start over. Rebuilding may be slow, but it's possible. And every decision we make after a fall becomes a revelation of who we truly are. My decision was to lift my head, to transform tears into seeds, to rediscover joy in small gestures, and above all, to not allow my story to be erased. Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever believed that everything you did wouldn't be remembered? I know how much it hurts, but I want you to know, your voice matters. Share in the comments how this story made you feel, because it's in this exchange that we find strength. Your participation isn't just a response. It's a way to show the world that we still believe in the value of gratitude, justice, and truth. And if this message resonated with you, please like this video. This simple gesture helps spread this content, helping others who may be experiencing something similar find some solace, or even courage. And if you want to continue walking with me, hearing real stories, revelations that are often hidden behind the scenes of life, subscribe to the channel. This is how this community grows. This is how we become stronger. What you don't learn through love, life teaches you through pain. I learned this the hard way, but I learned it. And so I leave here a reminder so no one forgets. Our story, our pain, and our lives have value. Always. And as I say this, I feel my journey isn't over yet. There's more to be revealed, more paths to travel, and I know that each step will bring new discoveries about who I am and what I can still be. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for walking this story with me. I know it wasn't easy to hear every detail, but I believe that, in some way, it also brought important insights to your attention. And since you stuck with me until the end, leave the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," in the comments. It will be our way of showing that we are not alone on this journey. If this content touched something deep inside you, please leave a like. This simple gesture helps keep the connection we've built alive and allows more people to discover messages that truly matter. And, of course, subscribe to the channel. Here, each story is told with truth, emotion, and purpose, so that we never forget our worth. And if you want to continue with me, there's a video right here that complements this topic. Click and follow me there, because we still have a lot to share together.